Creek Studios.
Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussions of violence, death, and trauma. Listener discretion is advised. This story is drawn from public records, court records, historical reporting, and community accounts. Legal outcomes are described as they appear in the available record. Where the record leaves gaps, some details have been reconstructed for clarity. Those reconstructed details are not presented as established fact. In 1981, at a small airport in the mountains of Appalachia, a twin-engine Beechcraft Queen Air landed, and what was found on board got the attention of local authorities. But the deeper they dug into what they had found, the stranger the story got. Because this wasn't just about an airplane, and it wasn't just about what was on board. It was about the man connected to it, a man whose story was only beginning. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. And if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Now, to understand how all this got started, we need to go back to East Tennessee in the early 1980s, to Sevier County, right there in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains. And if you've ever been to Gatlinburg, you probably know what that area looks like today. It's one of the busiest tourist destinations anywhere in Appalachia. But even back then, Gatlinburg was already a place people came from all over the world to visit. And sometime around 1980, a man showed up there who seemed to have plenty of money to spend. His name, at least as far as most people around Gatlinburg knew, was Jerry Whittier. Whittier presented himself as a successful businessman. He bought an expensive chalet in the area, reportedly gave money to local charities, spent money around town, and seemed interested in becoming part of the community. There were even reports that his interest in the area went beyond buying a chalet and settling into the community. It involved the local airport. Whittier and another man, Charles Kegler Sr., were reportedly working together to obtain the lease to operate and manage the Sevier County Airport. Now, at the time, that probably wouldn't have seemed strange at all. Whittier was a pilot, and as far as people around Gatlinburg knew, he was a wealthy businessman looking to invest in the area. But considering what was about to happen at that very airport, that little detail would eventually become a whole lot more interesting. A wealthy businessman comes into a tourist town, buys an expensive house, spends some money, and talks about opportunities to invest. There wasn't necessarily anything there that would make people suspicious of him. But in March of 1981, an airplane was making its way towards the mountains of East Tennessee, and apparently someone was already watching it. Federal authorities had reportedly tracked the airplane from Columbia to Florida and eventually into Tennessee. Then Tennessee authorities got a request. Federal officials wanted to know if an airplane with a particular tail number had landed at the Sevier County Airport. So two TBI agents, that's Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, David Davenport and Bob Denny, were sent out there to check. And according to Davenport, that was about all they were told. They didn't know what was on the airplane. They didn't know exactly what they were walking into. They were simply looking for a particular plane. And when the agents got there, they found the airplane. There were 4 men connected to what was happening there that day. 2 of them, Charles Bubba Kegler Jr. and Clarence Dennis Newell, had reportedly flown the airplane into Sevier County. According to contemporary reports, waiting for them at the airport were 2 other men, Charles Kegler Sr., and a man people around Gatlinburg knew as Jerry Whittier. Then, while TBI agents were there, a local police cruiser happened to come down the road. According to later accounts, The men apparently thought more law enforcement was coming, and they ran. And when I say they ran, I don't mean they jumped into another airplane and took off. They took off on foot. Now imagine being one of those investigators for a minute. You've come to this little airport in the mountains looking for an airplane. You find it. There are several men standing around it. Then a police car comes into view, and suddenly those men start running. At that point, you're probably going to be pretty interested in whatever is inside that airplane. And when investigators looked inside the airplane, what they found amazed them. Inside, they found cocaine. Not a few bags hidden underneath a seat. Not something somebody could slip into a suitcase. Investigators recovered approximately 614 pounds of cocaine, reportedly nearly pure. That's about 278 kilos. And to put that into perspective, federal drug officials at the time estimated the cocaine had a street value of more than $200 million. We're talking about more than a quarter of a ton of cocaine sitting inside an airplane at a small airport in the mountains of Appalachia in East Tennessee. At the time, it was reportedly one of the largest cocaine seizures from an airplane ever made in the United States. And suddenly, investigators had a whole lot of questions. Where had the airplane come from? Where was all that cocaine going? Who owned it? And who were the men who had just run away? As investigators began sorting through all that, one of the names that came up was somebody people around Gatlinburg already knew. Jerry Whittier. The wealthy businessman, the man living in the expensive chalet, the man who gave money to charity, the pilot who had reportedly even shown an interest in taking over operation of the local airport. Except investigators were about to discover something else about Jerry Whittier. There was no Jerry Whittier. His real name was Gerald Lyle Hemp, and Jerry Whittier wasn't the only name he had used. Over the years, law enforcement would connect Hemp to numerous aliases, and investigators were now beginning to get a different picture of the man who had been living there in Gatlinburg. And Hemp wasn't standing around waiting for them to come and ask questions. He was gone. He had disappeared. Authorities began looking for him, and that search would eventually carry them well beyond the mountains of Appalachia and beyond the borders of East Tennessee. But as they started digging into the life of Gerald Hemp, they began finding pieces of a world that stretched a long way from Gatlinburg. There were connections to Florida. There were other identities. There were other people investigators wanted to know more about. And eventually, there would be question about Gerald Hemp that went far beyond the cocaine found inside that plane. But first, authorities had to find him. And for more than a year, Gerald Hemp managed to stay one step ahead of them. The search for Hemp eventually moved south. And in early 1980s, if you were looking for somebody connected to a major cocaine operation, South Florida wasn't an unusual place to end up. At the time, enormous amounts of cocaine were coming into Florida from Colombia and other parts of Latin America. There were networks of smugglers, pilots, boats, and airplanes moving drugs into the country and then farther north. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Gerald Hemp had managed to disappear. Then, in 1982, investigators finally tracked him to South Florida. And once again, Gerald Hemp wasn't Gerald Hemp. He was living under another identity. Now, later accounts of Hemp's capture described authorities finding some unusual items, including weapons and night vision equipment. There have even been reports of information concerning DEA operations. But I've had trouble tracing some of those details back to contemporary records, so I'm not going to tell you we know exactly what authorities found. What we do know is this wasn't some small drug case. More than 600 pounds of cocaine had already made that pretty clear. And Hemp wasn't the only person authorities were interested in. Among the other names connected to the case was a man named Charles Leslie Kegler Sr. and his son, Charles Kegler Jr. And the Keglers are important to what comes later. Because while investigators were still trying to untangle the people surrounding Hemp and the cocaine operation, something happened in Florida. Now, Charles Kegler Sr. wasn't just some name loosely connected to Gerald Hemp. According to contemporary reporting, Kegler Sr. was also wanted in connection with the cocaine case, and authorities alleged that he and Hemp were two of the men waiting at the airport when that airplane arrived. Like Hemp, Kegler Sr. disappeared after the cocaine was discovered. But on June 21st, 1982, while he was still a fugitive, Kegler's body was found off the coast near Jupiter Beach, Florida. He had suffered a serious head injury, and investigators found circumstances they believed suggested foul play. Hemp's name would later come up as investigators looked into Kegler's death, reportedly because of the connection between the two men and the cocaine operation. No charges against Hemp came from that investigation. Exactly what happened to Charles Kegler Sr. remained another unanswered part of the story. But now, one of the men allegedly connected to that cocaine operation was dead. After Gerald Hemp's capture, he was returned to Tennessee to face the charges against him. By then, prosecutors had an airplane containing more than 600 pounds of nearly pure cocaine, witnesses, and the people they believed were connected to the operation. But Gerald Hemp had an explanation. He wasn't denying his connection to the airplane. What he denied was knowing the cocaine was there. According to Hemp, there was another reason he was involved with those airplanes and the people surrounding them. And this is where the story takes a pretty strange turn, because Gerald Hemp said this wasn't supposed to be about cocaine. According to him, it was about guns. By 1983, Hemp was standing in a Tennessee courtroom claiming that he had been involved in supplying weapons to anti-communist groups in Central and South America, and he claimed those operations had the backing of the CIA. Now, anybody sitting in a courtroom can make a claim. That doesn't make it true. And prosecutors certainly didn't believe Gerald Hemp simply because he said it. In fact, District Attorney General Al Schweitzer Jr. would later say Hemp never produced evidence to back up his CIA story. As far as the prosecution was concerned, Gerald Hemp wasn't some covert operative. Schweitzer's position was that the evidence showed Hemp was a cocaine dealer. But Hemp wasn't the only person connected to this case telling a story about airplanes, guns, and anti-communist fighters. Remember Charles Bubba Kegler Jr., the son of Charles Kegler Sr.? Unlike Hemp and his father, Kegler Jr. didn't remain on the run. He was eventually arrested in Texas. He waived extradition and was brought back to Sevier County, where he was held on a $1 million bond. And in 1981, while Gerald Hemp and Charles Kegler Sr. were still fugitives, Kegler Jr. went to trial. He was convicted of possession of cocaine with intent to deliver and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But it was what Kegler Jr. said during that trial that becomes important to our story. Kegler Jr. testified that his father had told him he made a living smuggling weapons to anti-communist guerrillas in South America. He said he believed the trip involving the airplane was supposed to be another weapons run. According to Kegler Jr., he didn't learn they were dealing with cocaine until they were already on their way. Now again, Kegler Jr. was a defendant trying to explain his own involvement. So his testimony doesn't prove that his father's gun-running story was true. But here's what makes it interesting. Kegler Jr. was telling that story in 1981. 2 years later, Gerald Hemp would stand in a Tennessee courtroom and tell a remarkably similar story. Airplanes, weapons, anti-communist fighters in Latin America, and in Gerald Hemp's version, the CIA. And what makes that worth paying attention to isn't just what Hemp was saying, it's when he was saying it. Because this was 1983. By 1983, American involvement with anti-communist forces in Central America wasn't entirely secret. There had already been public reporting about U.S. support for groups fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So Gerald Hemp didn't necessarily need some secret connection to the CIA to know that much. But many of the stories that would later bring together airplanes, cocaine trafficking, Central America, and covert American operations had yet to become widely known. And that's what makes the timing of Hemp's story interesting. And it raises a question. Was Gerald Hemp simply telling a story he thought might keep him out of prison? Or had Gerald Hemp heard things through the world he was involved in that most people hadn't. Because not long after Gerald Hemp made those claims in that Tennessee courtroom, another pilot would become famous for a story involving cocaine, Central America, and the United States government. His name was Barry Seal. Now, if the name Barry Seal sounds familiar, there's a pretty good chance you've heard at least part of his story before. And even if you haven't, you may have seen the 2017 movie American Made, where Tom Cruise played Seal. Now, that was a Hollywood movie, so we're not going to use it as a history lesson. But the real Barry Seal was a pilot from Louisiana who became one of the most notorious cocaine smugglers in the country. By the early 1980s, Seal was moving large quantities of cocaine into the United States by airplane. And eventually, after getting caught, he began cooperating with federal authorities. In 1984, Seal took part in a federal undercover operation that carried him into Nicaragua. Cameras were installed aboard his airplane, and photographs were taken showing cocaine being loaded into it. And that's where Barry Seal becomes interesting to our story. Because Gerald Hemp had already stood in a Tennessee courtroom the year before, in 1983, talking about airplanes, gun running, anti-communist forces in Central and South America, and the CIA. So naturally, when you put those two stories side by side, you start wondering if there could have been some connection. And I wondered the same thing. So I went looking for one. And as interesting as that possibility might be, I haven't found one. I haven't found evidence that Gerald Hemp and Barry Seal knew each other. I haven't found an airplane we can document both men using. I haven't found a business connecting them. And I haven't found a court record or a law enforcement document that puts the two men together. So I'm not telling you Gerald Hemp was connected to Barry Seal. And I'm definitely not telling you Hemp's CIA story was true. But their timelines are interesting. And that's really why Barry Seal matters here. And remember, Hemp was telling his version of this story in 1983. And Charles Kegler Jr. had already testified about his father's alleged gun running back in 1981. Both of those things happened before Barry Seal's Nicaragua operation became public in 1984. So, where did Hemp's story come from? Maybe he made it up. Maybe it was simply the best explanation he could come up with for why a man living under different names was flying around with people involved in smuggling. Or maybe Hemp had heard things through the world he was already involved in that most people hadn't. His own attorney, Gordon Ball, would later remember that Hemp always maintained he had CIA connections. Ball also remembered Hemp as somebody who, at least in his own mind, considered himself a soldier of fortune. But whatever Gerald Hemp wanted the jury to believe about who he was, it didn't work. The jury convicted him, and the sentence was substantial. Hemp received 4 10-year prison sentences, and those sentences were supposed to run consecutively, one after another, for a total of 40 years behind bars. For a man who had spent years using different identities and staying ahead of people looking for him, it looked like Gerald Hemp had finally reached the end of the road. He'd been found. He had been brought back to Tennessee. He'd gone before a jury, and now he was supposed to spend a decade behind bars. Except Gerald Hemp wouldn't serve 40 years. He wouldn't even come close, because somewhere in the paperwork that followed his conviction, something went wrong. Those 4 10-year sentences that were supposed to run one after another somehow came to be treated as though they were all running at the same time. And that's a pretty big difference. Instead of Gerald Hemp looking like a man serving 40 years, on paper, he looked like a man serving 10. And that mistake made a very big difference. By February of 1984, Hemp had been classified as a medium security inmate. He requested a transfer closer to his family in Florida, and that request was approved. Think about that for a minute. Authorities had once spent more than a year trying to find Gerald Hemp after he disappeared from East Tennessee. They finally tracked him down in Florida, brought him back to Tennessee, convicted him, and gave him what amounted to 40 years in prison. And now, Gerald Hemp was being sent right back to Florida. Somewhere along the way, Hemp's situation changed again. Reports described him as being at a minimum security work release center in Lantana, Florida. And on July 10th, 1984, Gerald Hemp was given permission to leave the facility. It wasn't for work. It wasn't for court. It wasn't anything that, on the surface, sounded particularly important. Gerald Hemp had a dentist appointment. And on July 10th, 1984, they let him go. Now, this wasn't some appointment Gerald Hemp had made up just to get outside. He actually went to the dentist. Hemp went inside, sat down in the chair, and had his teeth cleaned. And when the appointment was over, he paid his bill. And according to prosecutor Al Schmutzer, the dentist later said Hemp paid him with a large amount of cash. Now remember, this was a man who was supposed to be serving a prison sentence. So seeing him carrying that kind of cash apparently got some attention. But what happened next was even more interesting. According to Schmutzer, the dentist later said Hemp told him that he wouldn't need a ride back. And then Gerald Lyle Hemp walked out the door. We don't know how long Hemp had been planning this either. But if the accounts about the cash and not needing a ride back are accurate, it sure doesn't sound like something he decided to do while sitting there getting his teeth cleaned. He had been given an opportunity, and Gerald Hemp took it. By the time officials realized what had happened, the man they had once spent more than a year trying to find was gone again. But Gerald Hemp apparently didn't immediately go silent. His attorney, Frank Rubino, later said Hemp called his office several times after the escape. Rubino said they tried to convince Hemp to turn himself in, but he never did. According to Rubino, those calls continued for a couple of months, and then they stopped. Authorities didn't find him. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And eventually, months became years. There were leads and reported sightings. In 1999, information even reached authorities that Hemp had reportedly been seen in Belize. And considering the life he claimed that he lived, that probably didn't sound impossible. This was a man who knew airplanes, had used different identities, and claimed to have connections in Central and South America. But a reported sighting isn't proof, and nobody was able to bring Gerald Hemp back. There was another possibility, too. Maybe Hemp hadn't successfully disappeared. Maybe something had happened to him. Remember, Charles Kegler Sr., whose death back in 1982 had already added another mystery to this story. Over the years, Hemp's name would turn up in other law enforcement investigations as authorities tried to entangle the people and relationships surrounding him. But none of that tells us ultimately what happened to Gerald Hemp. There were investigators who wondered whether Hemp himself may eventually have been killed. Considering the world he had been moving through, that certainly wasn't impossible either. More than 600 pounds of cocaine represented an enormous amount of money, and people involved in that kind of business could make some dangerous enemies. But maybe the answer is simpler than that. Maybe Gerald Hemp really was just that good at disappearing. He had already managed to disappear once before, and after this escape, authorities would spend years following leads without bringing Gerald Hemp back into custody. We just don't know. And more than 40 years later, we still don't, because Gerald Lyle Hemp's case has never officially ended. The United States Marshal Service still lists him as a wanted fugitive. If Gerald Hemp is alive today, he'd be 87 years old. Maybe he left the United States. Maybe he spent the rest of his life under another name. Maybe one of those reported sightings really was him. Or maybe Gerald Hemp died a long time ago, and nobody ever connected the man he had become with the man authorities were looking for. And then there's that other question, the one Gerald Hemp left behind in that Tennessee courtroom. Was there ever any truth to what he said about running guns, anti-communist fighters, and the CIA? Maybe he made the whole thing up. Maybe he'd heard those stories from people in the smuggling world. Or maybe there were pieces of Gerald Hemp's life that never made it into a courtroom or an investigative file. We may never know. But there is something else about this story that I think is worth thinking about. Remember, Gerald Hemp was sentenced to 4 consecutive 10-year sentences. 40 years. But somewhere along the way, those sentences started being treated as though they were running at the same time. 40 years became 10. Then came the transfer to Florida. Then the lower security setting. Then work release. And eventually, a man authorities had spent more than a year trying to find was allowed to leave for a dentist appointment. Now, maybe all of that really was nothing more than a mistake in the paperwork. But years later, even the prosecutor who had put Hemp behind bars wondered whether he might have gotten some powerful help along the way. In 2010, retired District Attorney Al Schmutzer told the Knoxville News-Sentinel, "I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but my gut feeling is he got help from someone or some agency with the power and leverage to get things done for him." And Schmutzer wasn't the only one who wondered about it. Former TBI agent David Davenport, one of the agents involved in the case from the beginning, would later say, "I have always been suspicious of the circumstances surrounding the escape." Now, neither one of those two men said they could prove the CIA helped Gerald Hemp, and neither can I. Maybe 40 years becoming 10 really was a clerical mistake. Maybe everything that happened after that was simply the result of that one clerical error. But remember what Gerald Hemp had been telling people before any of this happened. He claimed he had connections to the CIA. He claimed he had been involved in running guns to anti-communist forces in Central and South America. The prosecution didn't accept his story, and the jury convicted him. Maybe Gerald Hemp made the whole thing up. But there's one last thing about this story that I didn't realize till I started putting those dates together. Remember Barry Seal? The pilot we talked about earlier, and that undercover operation involving cocaine, Nicaragua, and the United States government? The one who had the movie made for him. Gerald Hemp walked out of that dentist office on July 10th, 1984. 7 days later, on July 17th, the story of Barry Seal's undercover operation in Nicaragua broke into the American press. Now, I'm not telling you those two things are connected. I found absolutely no evidence that they are. But think about the timing. A year earlier, Gerald Hemp had been sitting in a Tennessee courtroom talking about airplanes, gun running, anti-communist forces in Central and South America, and the CIA. Coincidence? It very well may be. But Gerald Hemp had been talking about that world before some of its strangest details became widely known to the public. And just as the rest of the country was about to hear a lot more about that, Gerald Hemp was gone. If you have any information about the whereabouts of Gerald Lyle Hemp or what happened to him after July 10th, 1984, contact the United States Marshal Service or your local law enforcement agency. Thank you for listening to Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider following the podcast and leaving a review. It really does help others discover these Appalachian stories. Until next time, I'm Kevin Austin, and remember, every root tells a story, and every shadow hides one.